Jung's most perilous revelation wasn't centered on healing trauma, but on what he called the final stage of the empath after enduring narcissistic abuse. A transformation that either obliterates them entirely or gives rise to something psychologically unprecedented. In his clinical work, Jung recorded cases of empaths who had survived prolonged narcissistic manipulation and eventually reached what he referred to as the ultimate phase of empathic evolution. Individuals who had undergone a complete inner metamorphosis. These weren't simple recovery narratives, but accounts of empaths who emerged possessing what Jung described as integrated shadow awareness and immunity to manipulation. He labeled this discovery dangerous because empaths who reached such a stage often became unrecognizable to those who had once known them. They developed what Jung called sovereign empathy, the power to feel deeply yet remain psychologically untouchable, an elevated consciousness he rarely encountered. Today, I'll uncover Jung's most dangerous finding about this ultimate empathic stage after narcissistic abuse, and why he believes such an ordeal either destroys empathic sensitivity forever or transforms it into what he termed the archetypal wounded healer, a consciousness that transcends both victim and survivor. The case that revealed this phenomenon emerged in 1928, involving a patient Jung mentioned only as M, a 34-year-old woman whose intense empathy had drawn a string of increasingly destructive narcissistic partners. When she first met Jung, he described her as psychically dissolved, her identity so eroded she could scarcely distinguish her own emotions from others. Yet over 2 years, Jung documented something astonishing. M didn't merely recover. She underwent what he called an alchemical rebirth through shadow integration. Once entirely open to every emotional current, she developed what Jung termed conscious permeability, the ability to deliberately choose what to absorb and what to deflect. In his notes, Jung wrote, "M has accomplished something I once deemed impossible, complete empathic sovereignty. She can sense the depths of another's suffering without being consumed by it. She detects deceit with almost supernatural precision. Most astonishing of all, she's become immune to manipulation while preserving her genuine compassion." The transformation was so absolute that Jung questioned whether M remained the same person. Her family noticed the difference instantly. Where she had once been the emotional caretaker, she now set firm, immovable boundaries. Former friends accused her of becoming distant or cold, but Jung perceived something extraordinary. M had reached the final empathic stage he had only theorized might exist. He even noted that her eyes had changed. "They hold depths I've never witnessed," Jung wrote, "as though she has looked into the abyss of human nature and returned not shattered, but enlightened." Jung concluded that narcissistic abuse functions as what he termed the empathic crucible, a psychological forge that either annihilates empathy or transforms it into something far more refined and powerful. The secret, he believed, lies in what he called shadow integration through forced individuation. During narcissistic abuse, the empath is compelled to confront their own shadow, the disowned, rejected facets of themselves. The narcissist, Jung observed, unconsciously acts as a shadow mirror, reflecting back the empath's own capacity for manipulation, selfishness, and detachment. Jung recorded that empaths typically endure what he called the 3 deaths in this process. First, the death of their idealized self-image as wholly good and selfless. Second, the death of their belief that love can heal everyone. And finally, the death of their dependence on external validation for self-worth. The empath must face their own shadow, Jung wrote, not through gentle reflection but through brutal confrontation with their own potential for darkness. The narcissist unknowingly becomes the catalyst for this vital psychological evolution. Jung found that those who survive this crucible emerge with what he called integrated empathy, the capacity to feel without fixing, to understand without taking on responsibility, and to love without losing themselves. This isn't emotional detachment but emotional mastery, a profound neurological and psychological shift Jung considered one of the rarest transformations of the human psyche. These empaths retained their sensitivity but gained what Jung described as a conscious filtering ability. They could perceive everything yet selectively choose what to process. Jung noted that this resembled the heightened awareness of advanced meditation masters, though achieved through trauma rather than deliberate spiritual training. He wrote, "The narcissist, in their unconscious role as a shadow teacher, compels the empath to build psychological strength they never realized they possessed." But Jung also uncovered something deeply unsettling about those who reached this final stage. They often became isolated, not by preference, but by necessity. The same transformation that granted them immense psychological power rendered them fundamentally incompatible with people still governed by unconscious drives. Jung observed that these evolved empaths could no longer endure what he termed psychological unconsciousness in others. They could instantly recognize when someone operated from ego projection or manipulation. This created what Jung called the consciousness gap, an unbridgeable divide between those who had integrated their shadow and those who had not. Jung's patient, described this vividly. "It's as if I can now see the inner machinery of everyone around me, their defenses, projections, hidden motives. It's all transparent. But that clarity has cost me nearly every relationship I had." Jung realized this was the concealed danger of empathic evolution. These individuals developed what he referred to as archetypal sight, the ability to perceive beyond surface personas into the deeper psychological patterns directing human behavior. While this made them exceptional healers and guides, it also rendered ordinary social interaction nearly impossible. Jung wrote, "They have eaten from the tree of psychological knowledge, and like Adam and Eve, they can never return to the garden of unconscious innocence." What disturbed him most was how others instinctively reacted to these transformed empaths. People could subconsciously sense their penetrating perception, their ability to see straight through psychological defenses, and often responded with fear or discomfort. Jung called this the prophet's isolation, being rejected not for being mistaken, but for seeing too clearly. He documented numerous cases where families, friends, and even fellow therapists felt uneasy in their presence, intuitively recognizing a depth of awareness they couldn't explain. From his extensive studies, Jung identified 4 primary paths that empaths take after narcissistic abuse, with only one leading to the final stage of transformation. Type 1. The dissolved empath. These individuals never regain a stable sense of self. Jung described them as psychic ghosts, present but not alive, perpetually lost in emotional confusion. Unable to separate their feelings from others, they exist in constant turmoil. Jung observed they often fall into perpetual victim consciousness, repeatedly attracting the same abusive dynamics. Type 2. The armored empath. These empaths protect themselves by shutting down their sensitivity entirely. Jung compared them to souls encased in psychological fortresses, safe from further harm, but cut off from their true nature. They avoid pain but also lose access to their intuitive depth, becoming cynical, detached, and emotionally distant, choosing safety at the expense of authenticity. Type 3. The wounded healer. These empaths channel their trauma into helping others. Though noble in intention, Jung warned that many remain trapped in compulsive rescue patterns. They set boundaries but still define their worth through being needed. They have not fully integrated their shadow, Jung wrote, and thus remain susceptible to subtle forms of manipulation. Type 4. The sovereign empath. This, Jung emphasized, represents the final and rarest stage, the full integration of empathic sensitivity with the shadow self. They have become what I can only describe as conscious vessels, Jung wrote, able to contain the entire spectrum of human emotion without corruption or depletion. Sovereign empaths, he found, possess several defining traits. They can sense others' emotions without taking responsibility for them. They instantly recognize manipulation but respond with understanding rather than hostility. They uphold strong boundaries without emotional walls, and they embody what Jung called archetypal wisdom, a profound comprehension of the psychological forces shaping human nature. The defining distinction, Jung explained, is that sovereign empaths have fully embraced their own shadow. They no longer project their rejected darkness onto others, rendering them immune to the psychological hooks narcissists depend on. Yet Jung also recorded several inherent dangers in reaching this final empathic stage, risks so severe that he sometimes questioned whether such evolution was worth its cost. The isolation factor. Jung noted that sovereign empaths frequently lived in profound solitude. They have outgrown the psychological level of most people, he wrote. The gap in consciousness becomes so vast that relating to others feels like adults trying to communicate with children. The divide simply cannot be bridged. Many of these individuals described feeling like outsiders within their own families and communities. The burden of sight. These empaths could no longer unsee the underlying psychological mechanics driving human behavior. Jung observed that many experienced what he termed archetypal fatigue, a kind of psychic exhaustion from constantly perceiving the same unconscious cycles repeating across relationships, politics, and society. They could foresee relational breakdowns, detect manipulation in public figures, and recognize emotional trajectories years before they unfolded. The weight of responsibility. Jung recorded that many sovereign empaths felt overburdened by their insight. They often saw solutions to others' struggles, yet knew that unsolicited understanding is rarely welcomed. This produced what Jung called the Cassandra complex, possessing accurate psychological perception that others either reject or fail to comprehend. The demand for authenticity. Perhaps most taxing, Jung noted, was their absolute intolerance for falseness, both within themselves and in others. They had become what he called truth sensors, immediately aware when someone was lying, performing, or manipulating. This made maintaining normal relationships extremely difficult. Jung wrote, "They have attained psychological mastery, but at the cost of ordinary human connection. They stand as bridges between the conscious and unconscious realms, yet bridges are crossed, not embraced." The most perilous condition Jung identified was what he termed archetypal possession. Some empaths became so consumed by their identity as healers or truth-tellers that they lost connection to their own humanity. To counter this, Jung designed what he called the shadow integration protocol, a process of psychological alchemy that transforms the lead of trauma into the gold of wisdom. Stage 1. Shadow acknowledgement. Jung taught that empaths must first admit their own capacity for manipulation, selfishness, and even cruelty. "You cannot integrate what you refuse to own," he wrote. This means recognizing how empathy can sometimes serve control, how victimhood may become a weapon, and how goodness can mask deeper psychological needs. Stage 2. Projection withdrawal. Here, empaths learn to reclaim the aspects of themselves they've projected onto the narcissist. Jung explained that the narcissist's grandiosity mirrors the empath's repressed need for recognition. The narcissist's manipulation reflects the empath's subtler control patterns, and their lack of empathy exposes the empath's own suppressed emotional numbness. Stage 3. Boundary alchemy. Instead of building walls, Jung taught conscious permeability, the ability to decide moment by moment what to absorb and what to deflect. This required cultivating what he called empathic discernment, feeling without fixing, understanding without rescuing, and loving without self-loss. Stage 4. Archetypal alignment. The final phase, Jung wrote, involves aligning with the wounded healer archetype, accepting that one's suffering has prepared them for a particular role in the collective psyche. This isn't about becoming a professional therapist, but embodying the fusion of wisdom and compassion that Jung saw as vital for humanity's evolution. He outlined concrete practices for each stage, including shadow dialoguing, consciously conversing with disowned aspects of the self, empathic fasting, intentional periods of emotional non-absorption, and archetypal meditation, tuning into the deeper symbolic patterns shaping human experience. Jung's central insight was that empaths must abandon the desire to return to who they were before the abuse. "The chrysalis cannot become the caterpillar again," he wrote. "The aim is not recovery, but metamorphosis." To explore what determines whether an empath ascends to sovereign consciousness or collapses under their sensitivity, Jung analyzed historical figures who endured similar psychic crucibles. His research revealed patterns that directly inform modern recovery from narcissistic abuse. The success pattern. Carl Jung himself. In private writings, Jung admitted that his own psychological theories emerged from surviving what he termed psychological persecution by authority figures who sought to exploit his empathic nature. "My tormentors unknowingly became my greatest teachers," he wrote, "forcing me to develop the psychological instruments that defined my life's work." Jung achieved sovereign empathy not by succumbing to bitterness, but by viewing his oppressors as case studies rather than enemies, transforming personal pain into insight and service. His own transformation became the model for empathic integration, a living example of turning psychic suffering into mastery. The success pattern. Historically documented cases. Jung recorded several patients who achieved similar levels of integration. 1. A composer who had survived an abusive marriage, transformed her suffering into music Jung described as archetypal, melodies that seemed to speak directly to the collective unconscious. Another, a physician, developed astonishing diagnostic insight after enduring psychological manipulation from his peers. The unifying factor Jung identified was their ability to reinterpret their trauma as initiation rather than victimization. They perceived their pain not as meaningless cruelty, but as preparation for a larger psychological and spiritual purpose. The failure pattern. The gifted who didn't integrate. Jung also studied empaths whose sensitivity ultimately destroyed them. He found they typically fell into one of two traps. Some remained fixated in victim identity, using their trauma as their sole source of meaning, while others became what Jung termed wounded wounders, individuals who weaponized their insight to control or manipulate others. The difference between the sovereign empath and the destroyed empath, Jung wrote, is not the depth of their trauma, but their willingness to transmute poison into medicine. The failure pattern, Jung observed, always involved shadow rejection, a refusal to acknowledge one's own capacity for the same darkness that once caused their suffering. Consciousness compatibility theory. Recognizing that sovereign empaths required entirely different relational dynamics, Jung developed what he called consciousness compatibility theory, a framework for identifying relationships that foster psychological safety and authenticity. Recognition signals. According to Jung, other evolved empaths can be recognized by their openness to psychological discussion without defensiveness, their comfort with paradox, their absence of superiority or self-righteousness, and their archetypal humor, the capacity to find lightness within the darkest corners of human experience. Safe relationship traits. Healthy connections for sovereign empaths, Jung noted, are marked by mutual respect for psychological boundaries, shared comfort in silence, the freedom to discuss shadow material without judgment, and what he termed conscious intimacy, a bond rooted in authentic self-revelation rather than projection or need. Community building strategies. Jung advised sovereign empaths to seek connection with others who had undergone comparable inner transformations, not necessarily through narcissistic abuse, but through any ordeal that demanded rapid psychological evolution. Compatible companions often included trauma survivors, spiritual seekers who had confronted their own shadows, or individuals who had endured major life transitions. He cautioned against maintaining ties with unconscious individuals out of guilt or nostalgia. The butterfly cannot pretend to still be a caterpillar, he wrote. To do so serves no one and dishonors the metamorphosis. Jung also recommended archetypal service, using one's refined empathic capacities to benefit the collective unconscious through teaching, healing, artistic creation, or by simply embodying integrated consciousness in daily life. The 5 metamorphoses of the empath. Jung described the transformation from wounded empath to sovereign empath as unfolding through 5 key metamorphoses, each defined by distinct psychological thresholds and challenges. Metamorphosis 1. The dissolution. This begins during active abuse, when the empath's old identity collapses entirely. Jung noted that it feels like psychological death, yet it is actually ego dissolution, the necessary breakdown before rebirth. He called this blessed disintegration, the destruction of false self-concepts. Metamorphosis 2. The descent. After the abuse, the empath enters what Jung described as the voluntary underworld journey. Here they must confront their own shadow, acknowledge their participation in destructive dynamics, and face their deepest fears of unworthiness and rejection. Though it often resembles depression, Jung clarified that this stage is actually psychological composting, decay that precedes new growth. Metamorphosis 3. The integration. At this stage, the empath begins to consciously choose which aspects of their shadow to embrace and which to transmute. Jung called this selective shadow incorporation. The empath learns to feel anger without cruelty, to acknowledge selfishness without becoming narcissistic, and to own power without using it for control. Metamorphosis 4. The emergence. Here, empathic sensitivity returns in purified form. Jung documented that individuals at this stage can sense others' emotions without absorbing them, recognize manipulation but respond with compassion, and love deeply without abandoning their own center. Metamorphosis 5. The sovereignty. The final stage marks the birth of what Jung described as archetypal consciousness, the capacity to perceive beyond personal psychology into the vast symbolic patterns that shape collective human behavior. This, he believed, represented the highest form of empathic evolution, the union of wisdom, compassion, and self-mastery. By the final stage of transformation, these empaths had become what Jung described as conscious bridges, beings who move fluidly between the personal and the transpersonal realms. Jung observed that each metamorphosis usually took 6 to 18 months, with the entire journey spanning 3 to 7 years of deliberate inner work. Yet, he emphasized that the timeline was never fixed. It depended entirely on one's willingness to confront the shadow and commitment to integration, not just healing. Still, Jung warned that several psychological traps could derail an empath on this path, subtle pitfalls that could stop them from ever reaching true sovereignty. The spiritual superiority trap. Some empaths, upon awakening to their expanded awareness, began to believe their suffering made them more evolved than others. Jung called this spiritual grandiosity, a form of ego inflation disguised as enlightenment. The moment one believes they are beyond the shadow, he wrote, they are possessed by it. The perpetual healing trap. Others became addicted to transformation itself, endlessly chasing new healing methods without ever embodying their growth. Jung referred to this as therapeutic materialism, turning healing into consumption instead of integration. The isolation addiction trap. While solitude is necessary for deep integration, Jung warned against using it as a shield to avoid human connection. True sovereignty, he said, serves consciousness through engagement, not withdrawal. The revenge trap. Some empaths, now aware of psychological dynamics, unconsciously use their insight to manipulate or punish those who had hurt them. Jung wrote, "True integration transforms the desire for revenge into compassion for the unconscious." To stay balanced, Jung recommended a daily practice he called shadow check-ins, moments of honest self-reflection to examine one's motives, projections, and emotional triggers, ensuring the psyche remained clear and conscious. Jung's final insight about sovereign empaths was his most profound. He believed they represented an evolutionary leap in human consciousness, essential for humanity's psychological future. The sovereign empath, Jung wrote, embodies the next stage of human evolution, an individual capable of feeling the full range of human experience while remaining centered in their truth. He saw these evolved empaths as midwives of consciousness, guiding others through their own shadow work and helping humanity heal its collective trauma. Their pain, he concluded, was not personal, it was archetypal, part of a greater human transformation. The empath who survives narcissistic abuse and reaches sovereignty undergoes what Jung called the ultimate individuation, becoming wholly themselves while serving something greater than themselves. Jung's most dangerous discovery was also his most hopeful, that our deepest wounds, when integrated, become humanity's greatest gifts. The sovereign empath stands as living proof that wisdom can be born from suffering, that consciousness can rise from catastrophe, and that what once sought to destroy us may, in truth, be what transforms us. As Jung wrote in his final notes, the narcissist unknowingly serves as the dark priest of the empath's initiation. Through their cruelty, they forge the very consciousness that will one day heal what they represent. If you recognize yourself in Jung's description of empathic evolution, comment below, "I am becoming sovereign." Your transformation is not just your healing, it is part of humanity's evolution. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.